Whenever we study a book of biblical history, like Joshua, it's always important to remember that the same historical events can be told in many ways without introducing errors. Every biblical book that reports historical events organizes the history it reports in order to accomplish particular purposes and to emphasize certain perspectives for its original audience.
We'll look into these matters in much more detail in later lessons. But at this point, we'll sketch the design and purpose of Joshua in 2 steps. First, we'll introduce its overarching content and structure, the large-scale arrangement of the book. And second, we'll comment on its original meaning, the impact our author hoped to have on his original audience. Consider first the content and structure of Joshua. The book of Joshua consists of 24 chapters that contain many different types of literature. We find narratives, reports, speeches, as well as lists of people and places that probably came from a variety of sources. Because of this, interpreters have analyzed the structural details of Joshua in different ways. But it's not difficult to see how its structure and content work together on a large scale.
Old Testament scholars have different ways of designating or identifying genre within various books in the Bible, but in general terms, the book of Joshua has 3 main types of literature within it. It has what we would call narratives or stories, the sorts of things that we would normally understand, like the story of the Battle of Jericho, those kinds of things. It also has long lists, geographical lists of places that various tribes inherited that were given to them by God, and would list one place after another, after another, after another. And then it also has sections where there is speech or speeches that are given by a particular person to another group of people. And you can see, if you just think about it in those 3 big categories, that those correlate roughly to the first major division and the second major division and the third major division of the book. The first is primarily narrative, the second is primarily geographical lists, and the third is primarily speeches. But the problem comes up in this way, and that is that within those major or umbrella genre designations, you also have the other 2 always sort of seeping in. And so as we deal with these various sections and these various genres in the book of Joshua, it's very important to keep them in mind and to be able to spot them as you go along. One of the greatest points of confusion that interpreters have, especially new interpreters or new students of the Old Testament, is that they will not recognize these various genres and won't treat them in ways that they need to be treated. And as we approach the book of Joshua, as anyone approaches the book of Joshua, if you don't focus on those various genres and how they're mixed together in different parts of the book, then it will lead to a great deal of confusion.
In brief, Joshua has 3 main divisions. Each division begins with a statement indicating a significant shift in time. The first division, in chapters 1 through 12, focuses on Israel's victorious conquest of Canaan, how Joshua led Israel to a decisive victory over the Canaanites. This division begins in chapter 1, verse 1, with the temporal notice that God commissioned Joshua after the death of Moses. These 12 chapters report a number of events that took place during Joshua's conquest of the land of Canaan. They begin with Israel's crossing of the Jordan and initial victories at Jericho and Ai. And these victories are followed by a covenant renewal ceremony in the vicinity of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. The narrative then moves to Joshua's major campaign against an alliance in the southern regions of the Promised Land. And this record is followed by Joshua's campaign against an alliance in the northern regions. The second division of our book, in chapters 13 through 22, deals with Israel's tribal inheritances, how the national unity of Israel was maintained as particular inheritances were allotted to the tribes of Israel. This division begins in chapter 13, verse 1, with the temporal statement, "Now Joshua was old and advanced in years." This second major division of Joshua first established the extent of territories that God granted to Israel, both in Transjordan, the lands to the east of the Jordan River, and in Cisjordan, the lands to the west of the Jordan River. It goes on to explain in some detail the specific allotments of lands to the tribes who received permission to settle in Transjordan. And it also spells out how God granted large territories west of the Jordan to Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh, as well as lesser territories to the other tribes of Israel. And when conflict arose between the tribes of Cisjordan and Transjordan, we learn how they maintained their national unity as the people of God. The third major division, in chapters 23 and 24, closes our book by giving attention to Israel's covenant loyalty, how Israel's loyalty and disloyalty to the terms of God's covenant would shape their future. It begins in chapter 23, verse 1, with another statement that alerts us to the passage of time. We read, "A long time afterward, when Joshua was old and well advanced in years." And this temporal notice is reinforced in verse 14 with Joshua's words, "I am about to go the way of all the earth." These last two chapters of our book focus on two assemblies that Joshua held near the time of his death. The first of these assemblies probably took place in Shiloh, a holy site that played an important role in Joshua's day and later in the period of the Judges. And it closes with a final assembly at Shechem, the place where Abraham built his first altar in the land of Canaan. All of Israel gathered at these assemblies, and Joshua warned them against flagrant violations of God's covenant. Then, the main body of our book closes with Joshua leading the people of Israel in renewing their commitment to be loyal to God alone. They vowed to reject the gods of all other nations and serve the God of their fathers according to the terms of his covenant with them. Following this covenant renewal, the book closes with an afterword that includes Joshua's death and several subsequent events. We've explored the design and purpose of Joshua by considering the book's content and structure. Now we're in a position to ask how we should summarize the original meaning of Joshua. What was our author's purpose for writing his book?
In many ways, it's fair to say the author of Joshua wrote with purposes that every biblical author shared. He designed his book to honor God, and he sought to further God's kingdom by applying the principles of God's covenants to the concepts, behaviors, and emotions of his original audience. But as we study the book of Joshua, we can also identify the special emphases that our author had for his audience as he wrote his book.
There are many ways to summarize the original meaning of Joshua, but for our purposes, we'll express it along these lines. The book of Joshua was written about Israel's victorious conquest, tribal inheritances, and covenant loyalty in Joshua's day to address similar challenges facing later generations. As we can see, this summary refers to the three main divisions of the book of Joshua: victorious conquest, tribal inheritances, and covenant loyalty. But why did our author focus on these matters? As our summary suggests, first, he sought to remind his audience about events in Joshua's day. And second, he wrote to address later generations and the similar challenges they faced. Let's look at both of these purposes, starting with why our author wrote about Joshua's day. Everyone familiar with the book of Joshua knows that it deals most explicitly with the events that took place when Joshua led Israel. These include Israel's victorious conquest of Canaan, Joshua's division of Israel's tribal inheritances, and Israel's covenant loyalty to God. So, it's fair to say that one of our author's central purposes was to inform the original audience of what had happened in that world, the world of Joshua's time. Many Old Testament passages stress that the Israelites often lost their way because they forgot what God had done for them in the past. Our author hinted that this was a problem for his original audience when in chapter 24, verse 31, he distinguished himself and his audience from those who had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. The original audience of our book needed to be reminded of what had happened in the days of Joshua, whether they lived in the period of the Judges, during the monarchy, or during the Babylonian exile. So, on a basic level, we may say that the author of Joshua wrote to give his original audience a true record about what had been accomplished in Joshua's day. In the second place, as our summary suggests, the book of Joshua was also written to address the challenges of later generations. Our author stood, as it were, between two worlds: that world, the world of Israel in Joshua's day, and their world, the world of the original audience. For this reason, our author didn't simply write a record that was true to historical facts. He also wrote about Israel's victorious conquest, the distribution of tribal inheritances, and the call to covenant loyalty to provide meaningful points of contact or connections between that world and their world. Like other biblical authors, he frequently pointed out historical backgrounds that explained the origins of his audience's current privileges and responsibilities. He also presented models for them to emulate or reject. And on a few occasions, he wrote accounts of Joshua's times as foreshadows of his original audience's experiences. These kinds of connections reveal something about our author that we need to keep in view. On the one side, he wanted his audience to remember what had happened in Joshua's day, but on the other side, he didn't want them to return to doing things precisely as Israel had done in Joshua's day. His original audience lived in a different time, and they needed to apply his historical record to their lives in ways that were appropriate for their own day.
I believe that the original audience of the book of Joshua were greatly impacted by its message. All the promises that God made, all of them were fulfilled to Israel concerning their coming into the promised land. Not one of them failed. And I think this is at the core to teach the people God is faithful. God has been faithful and will remain faithful. And this is especially important in they're moving into the time of the Judges, because in the time of the Judges, we see them described as a people who are doing what's right in their own eyes. But what they've been called to is faithfulness to Yahweh. And so this is a message to them that they see in the life of Joshua and those who were faithful along with Joshua in light of where they are now, where this generation is not truly following in the footsteps of Joshua, and it is a call to them to repent, really, and come back to who they were called to be.
Now, at times, modern interpreters have difficulty grasping how the original audience was meant to apply this historical record to their lives. After all, our author didn't spell out these matters in his book. But we need to remember some viewpoints that our author and his audience would have learned from the scriptures available in their day, what we know as the Pentateuch. With these perspectives in mind, the implications of our author's record of that world for their world are not as difficult to discern as it may first appear.
Consider how the Pentateuch set the stage for understanding the implications of Israel's victorious conquest for the original audience. This division of our book gave a record of Joshua's great victories, but three basic outlooks on warfare derived from the Pentateuch help them see how to apply this part of Joshua. In the first place, both our author and his original audience knew that they were engaged in a war that was rooted in the primeval conflict between God and Satan. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 indicates that throughout human history, after the fall into sin, God and Satan have been in conflict. This invisible conflict is visible on earth in the struggle between the seed, or descendants of the serpent, people who serve satanic powers, and the seed or descendants of the woman, people who serve God. This is why the book of Joshua doesn't reduce Israel's conflict to just a physical war. Rather, in Joshua chapter 5, verse 14, our author referred to the angelic commander of the army of the Lord. This passage indicates that Joshua and the army of Israel were participating in a battle involving God and his angelic army. And as passages like Joshua chapter 23 verse 16 indicate, our author also recognized that the Canaanites' satanic gods stood alongside the Canaanites in opposition to the people of Israel. Joshua's original audience had much to learn from Israel's conquest because, just like the Israelites in Joshua's day, they knew they were engaged in this ongoing conflict between God and Satan and those who served them. In the second place, the Pentateuch also made it evident that Joshua's conquest was Israel's special conflict. While the original audience could learn a great deal from Israel's conquest, they and the generations to come were not to imitate it in every detail. The Pentateuch made it clear that Joshua's day was extraordinary. In Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16, God told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in Egypt for a time because the iniquity of the Amorites, another name for Canaanites, was not yet complete. But by the time of Joshua's conquest, Canaanite sin had grown so offensive that God called for their total destruction, much like he had called for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the days of Abraham. This is why our author drew from the vocabulary of the Pentateuch and described Canaan's destruction using the Hebrew verb charam and the noun cherem. As Joshua chapter 6 verses 17, 19, and 21 illustrate, in the context of Joshua's conquest, these terms didn't mean simply to destroy. Rather, they meant to devote wholly to the Lord, or to destroy in devotion to the Lord. So, when the Israelites made war in Canaan, it was an acknowledgement of God's just judgment against flagrant Canaanite sin. And they destroyed and dedicated everything they conquered as an act of honoring God in worship. We know that this command for utter destruction and devotion to the Lord in Joshua's day was extraordinary for a number of reasons. For one, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 through 20, Moses directed total destruction for the Canaanites, but he commanded Israel to offer peace treaties to peoples outside the land of Canaan. Joshua himself acknowledged this distinction in Joshua chapter 9 when he made a treaty with the Gibeonites, believing they had come from outside of Canaan. In addition to this, the extraordinary character of Joshua's conquest becomes evident when we recall how the ongoing conflict between God and Satan took different forms, both before and after Joshua. To mention just a few examples, before Joshua, in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, God and his heavenly army went to war against rebellious human beings at the Tower of Babel. But they did this without a human army and simply scattered the people. In Genesis chapter 14, verses 1 through 24, Abraham fought with God's help, but God didn't order the total destruction of Abraham's enemies. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, we learn that God went to war against the Egyptians and their gods during the plagues on Egypt. But Israel was passive, and God didn't kill every Egyptian. In Exodus chapter 14, at the Red Sea, Israel followed God obediently in battle formation, but it was God who destroyed Egypt's army. similar variety also appears after the days of Joshua. As the book of Samuel explains, David fought many of Israel's enemies with God's supernatural help. But God didn't devote all of his enemies to utter destruction. The book of Kings indicates that the same was true of many generations of David's royal descendants. And Israel's prophets predicted that the end of Israel's exile would unfold in connection with war through unrivaled miraculous divine intervention. As we can see, God's ongoing conflict with evil unfolded in a variety of ways in the Pentateuch and throughout the Old Testament. This alerts us to the fact that Joshua's conquest wasn't the norm for all battles. Of course, the original audience could learn many lessons about warfare in their day from Joshua. But the conquest itself was a time of extraordinary judgment. Unlike many other battles, God determined at that time that the Canaanites, with rare exceptions like Rahab, fully deserved utter destruction.
The sin of the Canaanites gradually grew over time to be particularly heinous. In the book of Genesis, there is a allusion in Genesis chapter 15, I believe, to the sin of the Amorites reaching its full measure. It's not until then that God's people will take possession of the land. So there is this notion in the scriptures that God is watching the Canaanite nation as it declines and understands that when their decline reaches a certain point, that his justice will be poured out. Now, the instrument of his justice is the nation of Israel, but not because the Israelite nation had great moral rectitude or anything of that sort. They're a very small nation. They're given to great sin, as we've seen, even in the generation prior to Joshua coming into that, and even in their conquest, there is sin. But the fact of the matter is, God in his grace has called that nation to himself, and is using that nation to exterminate and remove another nation that, if allowed to live there, is going to corrupt them. And that's another reason that God allowed the Israelite nation to go into Canaan, and they were to destroy everyone living there. God didn't want his people to be corrupted by the religious practices, their idolatry, the sin of the people living there, and he didn't want his nation to become patterned after the nations around them. He wanted them to follow him, with him as their king. And so the Israelite nation went in and, of course, did not complete that task entrusted to them. And so even within the book of Joshua, we see rumblings of it, what we see in fuller expression in the book after, the book of Judges, where the Israelite nation is increasingly corrupt and becomes more and more involved in a spiral of sin and decline, less characteristic of those that are in covenant relationship with God and more like the nations around them, all something that God sought to avoid by commanding the Israelites to go in and remove those living there.
In the third place, our author also knew from the Pentateuch that Joshua's conquest was but one step toward the future victory of Israel's king, the anticipated king who would reign over the whole world forever. Early on, the patriarch Jacob announced in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, that the royal family of Judah would receive the obedience of the peoples. In the period of the Judges, this hope in Judah's royal line was acknowledged in the leading role given to the tribe of Judah in Judges chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. During the monarchy, the fulfillment of this expectation was identified specifically with the house of David in passages like Psalm 72. And in many passages, Israel's prophets predicted that the exile would end with the victory of David's great son over all nations. So, like the Israelites in Joshua's day, the original audience knew they were part of something much greater than themselves. And for this reason, they were never simply to go back to what Joshua did. They had to apply what happened in the conquest of Canaan to their own day, as God continued to move history toward the future worldwide victory of Israel's king. our author expected his audience to have similar theological outlooks on the second division of his book, concerning Israel's tribal inheritances. In the first place, he understood from the books of Moses that Israel's possession of Canaan was rooted in God's primeval call for human dominion over the earth. God had ordained from primeval times that the earth would be turned into his kingdom as his faithful images filled and subdued it. This call was first reported in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 30, and later confirmed in Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. So, the record of Israel's tribal inheritances in the book of Joshua was clearly relevant for the original audience. Like the Israelites of Joshua's day, the original audience was also called to participate in God's commission to humanity, to have dominion over the earth. In the second place, our author rightly understood from the Pentateuch that God had established Israel's special inheritance. And the distribution of lands to Israel in Joshua's day represented the initial fulfillment of this inheritance. For instance, in Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 through 21, God promised Abraham an inheritance for his descendants that extended from the border of Egypt to the river Euphrates. So, drawing from the vocabulary of the Pentateuch, the book of Joshua frequently refers to Israel's possession of their land with the Hebrew verb nachal, meaning to inherit, and the noun nachalah, meaning inheritance. This terminology indicates that Israel's land was an enduring possession from God. For this reason, the original audience had much to learn from what Joshua had done in distributing their tribal inheritances. In the period of the Judges, disharmony among the tribes of Israel and troubles from other peoples disrupted Joshua's successes. During the monarchy, Israel's kings expanded Israel's lands, but they also experienced setbacks and losses. And of course, during the Babylonian exile, only a small remnant of God's people remained in the land, and they remained there only under the tyranny of other nations. So Joshua's distribution of Israel's tribal inheritances offered the original audience great insight as they sought to live in service to God in their own day. In the third place, our author also knew that Israel's inheritance of Canaan was but one step toward the future inheritance of Israel's king. At the appointed time, Israel's great and righteous king would possess every land and nation as he fulfilled humanity's original call to have dominion over the entire earth. As we've mentioned, Genesis chapter 49, verse 10 declares that one day a royal son of Judah will reign until he receives the obedience of the peoples. In addition, in Genesis chapter 17, verse 4, God promised Abraham, "You shall be the father of a multitude of nations." This is why in Psalm 2, verse 8, God said specifically to the house of David, "I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession." Israel's prophets announced many times that the land of David's great son would extend from one end of the earth to the other. And Paul summarized these Old Testament outlooks in Romans chapter 4, verse 13, when he wrote, "The promise to Abraham and his offspring was that he would be heir of the world." The implications for our author's original audience were clear. They were to apply what they read in the book of Joshua to the ways God was leading his people in their times toward the goal of this worldwide inheritance.
We see in Romans chapter 4 that the Apostle Paul interprets the promise of inheritance for Abraham and his offspring to include the whole world, and that may surprise us at first. We think of the Promised Land as only a strip of real estate along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. But this is really of a piece of the way Paul understands the Abrahamic covenant to be global, to be worldwide. So often he will talk about the seed, the children of Abraham, including not just his biological descendants, but really those who follow in the footsteps of Abraham. That is the footsteps of faith, who trust in the promises of God. In fact, Paul emphasizes that not only Jew, but also Gentile who believe in Christ are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to God's promise. The end of Galatians chapter 3. So when Paul says in Romans 4 that the promise is that Abraham's children, by faith, will inherit the whole world, he's really just extending that same understanding.
Just as with the first and second divisions of our book, the author of Joshua expected his original audience to keep certain theological outlooks from the Pentateuch in view as they applied the third division, Israel's call to covenant loyalty. In the first place, our author understood from the Pentateuch that covenant loyalty was rooted in the primeval requirement of human loyalty to God. Simply being images of God binds us to God by covenant, and this bond requires loyal service to Him. God's covenant with all of humanity in Adam required obedience, as indicated in Genesis chapters 1 through 3, and Hosea chapter 6, verse 7. And God's covenant in Noah, in Genesis chapters 6 and 9, revealed that all human beings are required to serve God by covenant. Because this is true of all people, in all times, the original audience could learn much from Joshua's call for covenant loyalty in his day. They, like all other human beings, were obligated to God's loyal service. In the second place, the original audience also had to be aware of Israel's special covenant loyalty. Our author was careful to note that, in the time of the conquest, Joshua exhorted the people to remain faithful to God's covenant, and the people vowed to do so. The original audience would have known of God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. Here, God required circumcision as a commitment to being blameless before Him. And the covenant God made in Moses in Exodus chapters 19 through 24 and renewed in the book of Deuteronomy made it clear that Israel was to obey the law of Moses. Now, in the third division of our book, Joshua focused on the trials that would come to Israel if they didn't fulfill these requirements, especially the requirement of rejecting false gods. And he set before them the possibilities of troubles, defeat, and exile from the promised land if they were unfaithful. By the time of the book's original audience, these trials had already begun to unfold. In the period of the Judges, Israel had entered into cycles of troubles. During the monarchy, more judgments came on Israel because of the repeated idolatry of the people and their kings. And during the Babylonian exile, the threat of losing the promised land had become a horrific reality. So, the original audience had to consider Joshua's warnings to Israel in light of God's judgments that they were facing in their own day. In the third place, what happened in Joshua's day also anticipated that God would make a future covenant with Israel's king. We know that Genesis chapter 49 verse 10 indicates that God had ordained for a king of Judah to reign. And Genesis chapter 17 verse 6 also indicates that Israel would have a king. Although Israel had no legitimate king during the period of the Judges, passages like Judges chapter 21 verse 25 and the end of Hannah's song in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 10 indicate that even during this period, the faithful looked for deliverance through Israel's royal family. Now, if the book of Joshua was written during Israel's monarchy or during the Babylonian exile, the original audience had to relate Joshua's call to covenant loyalty to God's dynastic covenant with David. In passages like 2 Samuel chapter 7 and Psalms 89 and 132, we see how God's covenant with David focused on the necessity of loyalty. David's royal line had to be loyal to God because they represented the people of Israel before God. In addition, according to the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 53, verse 11, eternal forgiveness would come in the future because of the substitutionary death of the righteous one, the Lord's servant, Israel's perfectly righteous king. And this great king is none other than Jesus, the Christ, who brought the new covenant predicted in Jeremiah chapter 31. This covenant will come in its fullness when Christ returns and makes all things new. As the original audience applied Joshua's call to covenant loyalty to their own times, they had to do so in the light of where they stood in these developments of the covenants God had made with His people. So, as we seek to understand the original meaning of the book of Joshua, we always have to keep in view that our author wanted his audience to learn what had happened in Joshua's day. But he also wanted them to apply his record of the victorious conquest, tribal inheritances, and the call to covenant loyalty in ways that were appropriate for their own times and circumstances. So far, in our introduction to the book of Joshua, we've looked into its authorship and date, as well as its design and original purpose. Now we're in a position to introduce the third main topic of this lesson: Christian application. How should the book of Joshua impact our lives as we follow Christ?